David Nakamura is in Washington, D.C. He's a reporter for The Washington Post joining us now. David, let's start with Michael Flynn. The White House pushing back against allegations that it's stonewalling Congress in its request for documents related to him. Just look at the optics of it. What are they?
Well, it's a problem that won't go away. I mean, Michael Flynn, of course, resigned under pressure in the wake of these allegations and questions about the Trump campaign's relationship with Moscow during the election. And what we know now is that Congress is saying very publicly today that they've discovered evidence that Flynn did not disclose, as he was required to, income that he received both for speaking engagement in Russia and as a consultant work that he did in his private time for the government of Turkey. And these are important questions. And so today at the White House press briefing, it was the #1 topic reporters asked about for Press Secretary Sean Spicer, who didn't have a lot of answers. It said, look, our administration is turning over what we can. The White House itself doesn't have some of these records that are being asked about. These are other government agencies. They're doing the best they can in releasing these to the congressional investigators. And he also said, look, we don't have a list of all the phone calls that General Flynn made while he was in the campaign or while he was serving as National Security Advisor. That's a lot of calls, a lot of contacts. We just didn't think to keep those records. We don't have them. So we've turned over what we do have.
And people were even asking just about the idea that wasn't it the White House's job to know whether or not things had been passed by in regards to the security clearance? Again,
Sure.
it goes to optics. Doesn't it just look bad right now for them?
It goes to optics. Also goes to the idea that as they were staffing up, they weren't prepared during the campaign. There was this idea that candidate Trump didn't want to look too far ahead, and maybe sort of count his chickens before they hatch. Idea, but that maybe you should preparing behind the scenes, doing some vetting of folks that you might be considering for these high-level jobs. And as they quickly staffed up, they didn't do as much sort of background checking and research as they should have. Now, they're saying, look, if he didn't disclose this information as he was required to, that's something for the congressional investigator to determine, for law enforcement agencies to determine whether he broke the law. That's not something we do. But certainly, we're in a week where the president is leading up to his first 100 days. They're trying to tout achievements, look forward. Now they're being dragged back to someone who doesn't even work for the administration anymore, but is still very much a center of this ongoing investigation.
You mentioned that 100-day mark. We've heard a couple things. It's overblown, and then there's a new website up to tout all of those achievements that Sean Spicer pointed to. Which is it?
You've heard that both from directly from the president himself and his aides. Look, I think they want it both ways. They know that there's going to be some critical stories saying, look, there already have been. This president has not done as much as other presidents in his first 100 days legislatively or on other measures. And they're saying, look, if the press is going to write these kind of stories, we got to be aggressive in touting what we have done. And so you saw a big news release today of all the executive orders this president has signed and how that compares to the past. Other legislative bills that he signed into law, although small in some cases, they've ranked those compared to other presidents, shown how that they match up. But on the other hand, I think they're also saying, and the president himself has said, look, this is an artificial number created by the press and created by people who are trying to put labels on things. So don't hold me just to that. We have a 4-year presidency, which is fair to some degree. But you're seeing them already this week sort of throw out ideas, new ideas, even talk about maybe a tax plan tomorrow they're going to release to try to show activity leading up to this 100 days.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's sort of the key that there's activity. And you mentioned that tax plan. Let's look to that on Wednesday. We've heard talk of the corporate tax being cut from 35% to 15%, that would be the recommendation that we may hear. How realistic is that?
Well, look, that's just a starting point. This is we're understanding this is going to be sort of broad strokes to show that the president is pursuing a major campaign promise to slash corporate tax rates, potentially have a tax cut for maybe the middle and upper classes, depending on what view you take. And this is something he promised during the campaign. The big questions are, how do you pay for this? Do you pay for it? Does it add to the deficit? That remains to be seen, and whether he'll package infrastructure spending with this, as he sort of floated, to try to go across the aisle and maybe get some Democratic votes. Real reform on taxes is something that's very difficult and has eluded many administrations, including the Obama administration, which often talked about it. And it's not easy. It's very difficult. Obviously, there's still the health care repeal and replace that remains out there, not having gotten done, also contributes to problems in how you address this spending plan. So there's a lot that remains out there. I think what you're going to hear tomorrow is the administration, putting some numbers out there that probably match the campaign rhetoric, as you said, and then using that to sort of launch negotiations, but to try to get a lot of momentum going early on to sort of start off the talks.
With each answer you give me, there are just so many more questions. Just this idea of bipartisanship, could it be on this tax overhaul issue? that we may see it?
We've seen reports now that they could add the infrastructure, they could add a child care tax credit, something that Ivanka Trump has supposedly worked on to some degree. These are things that Democrats, would be interested in. There's no question about it. And I think both parties would have reason to potentially get involved here and maybe get behind something. The question, of course, the devil is in the details. And there's going to be a lot of details that we need to see before we have any sense of how quickly Congress can go forward. And again, I mentioned this, but it remains a question. This president had said, we're moving on to taxes. We're putting health care behind us for now. But then he said, no, actually, we need to get the health care done because that could help answer some questions about revenues and spending that would, we'd need to know before we get into the details of tax reform. So again, the sequencing of that, as well as sort of the details of tax reform and infrastructure, all need to be sort of talked about, maybe over the next few months now. And there's even a sense in the administration that, it's unlikely this could get done in August, which is what the goal they initially set for tax reform, that it could extend past this year even. Yeah,
you mentioned the Affordable Care Act as one of the repeal and replace was one of the promises. Also the border wall, which is where I want to go. We've heard the talk sort of de-escalate in the past day or so about this idea that a budget would be held up in order to pay for the border wall, the start of construction. Where do we stand in regards to that now? At least
the border wall was probably the president's top promise on the campaign trail. You'd build a big, beautiful wall, and Mexico would pay for it. We know the Mexican government has said no way. The president said, let's get some funding to start off. That funding is unlikely to be in this spending plan. You saw the president back off in a private meeting he had with conservative media yesterday at the White House, in which he said he would not use that demand to hold up a bill. And you're now seeing even the Republican members of Congress saying not including that in their latest proposal on the temporary spending plan. So it's unlikely to happen now. They're saying they may come back to it in the fall. But there's sort of widespread opposition to really using a lot of public money for this wall. There's some hardline conservatives who want it, but you're even seeing some moderate conservatives and Democrats certainly say, look, we don't want to talk about this now. We need to keep the government open. This is not going to get in the way. So it's unlikely we're going to see that this week.
Well, and even if we don't see it this week, it was something that President Trump, as candidate Trump, talked about so often. Yeah. I guess what does this do as far as the president's word going forward?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's some sense in the White House, as long as the president makes good on some of the other promises on border security, that the wall itself can be sort of held up to some degree as a symbol. And you are seeing now in the first couple months, a drop in the number of people coming across the border illegally, and they're touting that. Now, whether that continues in the warmer summer months, we don't know. But that's, and if they could show progress of maybe ramping up deportations inside the country, which they have tried to do, maybe they can sort of put off talk of this border wall. But you are seeing some conservatives, talk show folks as well, start to bring this up and say, look, the president has to make good on this promise. He has to hold firm on this. And if he's not going to do it now, I think you could start to see people sort of peel off who supported Trump very much because of his promises on immigration, begin to sort of second guess and say what's happening. But again, if you do see progress in other areas, maybe they can sort of buy some time.
David Nakamura with some great information for us from the Washington Post. David, thank you.
Sure, thanks a lot.